quite consciously placed this particular conversation within the current dissident knowledge is close to the strand put together by Boris Groys on art production today. Because Christopher and Tom have a couple of questions around the notion of art production as we envisioned it within this Congress. And I think they plan to get into dialogue with that under the title Art Beyond Spectatorship. Thank you for joining us, and gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria.
It's a particular honor to be speaking here, given the substantial influence of previous former West conferences in shaping the ideas that we're about to propose. So, who are we when we encounter art? Well, I'm Christopher Kulendran Thomas, and this presentation with my colleague Tom Trevatt is an inquiry into how contemporary art produces subjectivity. We'll consider the institutions, structures, discourses, and modes of circulation and distribution of art that have emerged through late capitalism's ideology of non-ideology. Living under the promise of political and economic and ethical freedoms, this subjectivity relies upon notions of spectatorship that assume art's purpose as the viewer's interpretation. We'll examine how the underlying logic of contemporary art interpolates the neoliberal subject, reinforcing individual privilege and perpetuating the fantasy of mankind's dominance over the world. Furthermore, we'll consider how contemporary art's biennializing global market distributes this form of spectatorship. Now, as the economic rationale for the neoliberal project collapses, with its austerity program failing in Europe and our new supereconomies growing through massive state intervention, and as we are reminded daily of impending environmental catastrophe, how do we rethink spectatorship beyond the liberal humanist foundations of contemporary art? The challenge for art, we claim, is to understand spectatorship as ecologically contingent within the extended continuum of both the organic and inorganic materiality of networks. Specifically, we'll address networks as sites of intersection between human and non-human materiality. And we'll ask what distributed networked art can produce beyond the finitude of interpretation, beyond spectatorship. But we'll start with a brief and subjective history of contemporary art. And this begins with Immanuel Kant. I'll quote him here from his critique of pure reason. Up to now, it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects, but all attempts to find out something about them a priori through concepts that would extend our cognition have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. Hence, let us once try whether we do not get further with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition. End quote. So that was Kant in 1781 with his critique of pure reason. And with this, Kant concludes that objective knowledge can't be possible outside human experience. In the words of the physicist and new realist philosopher Gabriel Catron, writing recently, Kant's assertion of human autonomy serves only to, and I quote, preserve the pre-modern landscape and stitch up the cosmological narcissistic wound. That wound is the wound of man decentered through Enlightenment science's Copernican revolution. To put it simply, if science decentered mankind in the universe, then Kant compensates for this by deciding that reality could only be correlated to and accessed from human experience. This is what philosopher Graham Harman calls the philosophy of access, or what Quentin Meillassoux calls correlationism. And this 200-year trajectory of continental philosophy, from Kant's compensating humanist injunction upon thought, could be seen as the original sin that laid out the path to contemporary art and the world that it inhabited. But to really understand the romanticism upon which contemporary art was founded, we must turn to its immaculate conception in Marcel Duchamp's original creative act. I quote here Duchamp from 1957. "The creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualification, and thus adds his contribution to the creative act." End quote. Duchamp shifted the precise location of art from production to interpretation, and with this, he enacted into art the Kantian fantasy that reality is produced by human experience. Duchamp's formulation of the creative act meant that, in Kantian terms, we could access the artwork only through our subjective relation to it. That art, again quoting Duchamp now from 1961, must be refined as pure sugar from molasses by the spectator. The reality of art was thereby limited to the viewer's experience of it, with art's consequences possible only through interpretation. Duchamp articulated this formulation of the creative act 40 years after the original controversy of his fountain. And it's at this time that his ideas were widely adopted through pop art's precursors. There are several published accounts, which I won't enumerate here, of Duchamp's influence on Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and John Cage, who reinvigorated interest in him. With Warhol's own ready-mades, Duchamp's art coefficient was adopted as the basic logic of what would then become contemporary art. And you know this history. Rejecting what was perceived as the elitist specialist language of abstraction, art now favored the vernacular language of mass media. Derailing Clement Greenberg's aspirations to determine art's terms of production, this new configuration of art prioritized the viewer's interpretation and thereby instilled in art for half a century Kant's philosophy of access, with no reality of art acknowledged outside our access to it. The interpretive pluralism brought about by this paradigm shift in art prefigured the ideal conditions for contemporary art that were yet to come. Although the term contemporary has been used throughout the second half of the last century to describe the art being made at the time, I would suggest that our usage of the term now refers more specifically to the particular ideological formation of art that emerged from the deregulation of financial services by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and the collapse of communism as a viable political alternative at the end of that decade. This was the world that contemporary art had been waiting for. The global ideology of non-ideology produced a contemporary art boom with, in Britain, for example, the first generation of wealthy young hedge fund managers providing the initial market for YBA in the 90s, later followed by Russian oligarchs, Middle Eastern wealth into the noughties, and then the emerging markets of China, and then India, and then Brazil through the global financial crisis. Despite their sometimes nominally oppositional politics, these artists were the children of Thatcher and wasted no time in forging an immediate relationship with their audience and their market. Taking control of their early trajectories with a proliferation of artist-run spaces, they worked in the vernacular language of mass media and played out their careers in the mainstream press. Absorbing the model of the hedge fund manager, who operates outside the old financial district of the City of London's aristocratic rules and institutionalized competencies, artist-run spaces soon became part of the institutionalized ecology of the art system. Whilst the wealth produced by the deregulated free markets created the perfect context for contemporary art, cultural economic feedback started to flow in the other direction too, as the model of the now superstar artist was adopted throughout the new cultural industries and then the wider economy as a model for insecure labor. Meanwhile, the Sirota-led revolution successfully repositioned contemporary art as a popular entertainment experience, with the example of Tate Modern adopted around the world to reimagine art institutions as retail propositions in line with an emancipatory social program to engage broad audiences in culture, essentially as a leisure market. But art was also instrumentalized more directly. Firstly, onto the front line of urban rebranding, with public art regenerating town centres all over the world. Secondly, onto the corporate social responsibility programs of most major corporations. And thirdly, through the education or community requirements of art institutions, co-opting social practice as social work. So far, so what? All this is pretty obvious, at least to the former West audience. But the crucial point here is one that we'll be returning to in our presentation, which is that art has always produced its reality structurally and not just through its viewer's interpretation. The most ambitious art entrepreneurs in the noughties understood this and used their positions as artists or as critics. For example, Anton Vidokal and friends with E-Flux, or Matthew Slotover and Amanda Sharp with the Frieze Art Fair, to organize the system of art on an industrial scale. By 2006, art had become, albeit on a financially small scale, probably the most sophisticated system of value creation in the history of the world. And the turbocharged art system that emerged during the preceding financial boom required artists to provide, at its peak, $60 billion a year, according to ArtNet, worth of window dressing for art's three main economic functions. One, the acquiring of status. Two, the cleansing of conscience. And three, the sheltering of tax. And just like the model of the artist prefiguring the idea of the cultural worker, the artist was now left as the ghost of state investment in public services, digging wells and planting trees. I'm going to skip over, I think, the Claire Bishop bit, because you all know that stuff, and at this rate, you won't get to hear Tom talk, and that's the clever stuff. So it may once have seemed as though contemporary art would continue its biennializing expansion forever, as sure as the neoliberal certainty that the era of big government was over. Contemporary art was seen at the time as a universal, non-specific, non-genre, just as its neoliberal world was sold as the product of a non-ideological, pragmatic economic strategy. But as the consequences of 2007's US subprime mortgage crisis have unfolded into a global recession, the world's strongest new supereconomies are growing through massive state intervention as the economic rationale for the neoliberal project collapses, leaving only a diminished quasi-religious belief in markets in its place. I suggest that it has now become crucial to look outside the envelope of that burst consumption bubble and see that both contemporary art and neoliberalism perpetuated a very particular and pretty much identical type of subjectivity. Both interpolated the viewer, consumer, citizen as a liberated, autonomous individual. And it's exactly this subjectivity that we artists have become experts in producing by addressing our viewers through work that's for interpretation, with space for the viewer to be free to experience art on their own individual terms. Well, this brings me to the question that I put to Tom when we began this inquiry. So Tom, contemporary art presents itself as a non-genre. It's often said that contemporary art can be anything, or rather that anything can be contemporary art. But what exactly are the limits of contemporary art, and what do these limits mean for who we are?
The first thing I'm going to talk about actually in this section is Boris Groys's widely read and taught essay, Equal Aesthetic Rights, in which he makes various explicit claims regarding the way that art produces, appropriates and mobilizes images. So I don't really need to rehearse this at length for this audience, but in short, this claim revolves around a central thesis that the autonomy of art abolishes every hierarchy through the regime of equal aesthetic rights for all artworks. So to quote Greuze, the art world should be seen as a socially codified manifestation of the fundamental equality between all forms, objects, and media. Relying on the deflationary logic of the ready-made, Greuze claims that the good artwork affirms the formal equality of all images under the conditions of their factual inequality, thus producing the conditions for art's political imaginary of complete equalization. Greuze claims that some artists transplant regional images into a mass media and some do the reverse and insert mass media images into a regional context, thus allowing a cross-cultural and economic flow of images to occur. Greuze here defends the equal rights of images to transcend boundaries, thus allowing the continual exchange of images as though they are of equal value without recourse to any particularity. Images just are empty tokens of the abstraction of equality and have no intrinsic value to impact on their free exchange. One image could be just another or another or another into the infinite. The types of emancipatory politics expounded here rely on a regime of inclusivity. To quote Greuze, the contemporary politics of emancipation is a politics of inclusion directed against the exclusion of political and economic minorities. For Greuze, the politics of emancipation is a presupposition of equality that signals, following a reading of Kojève, an end to art history, or specifically an end to the explosive or serious debates around the limits of art. As these ontological debates are all but played out historically, Greuze returns to the questions of judgment, suggesting that equality of visual forms does not mean an erasure of the difference between good and bad art, but that good art is constituted precisely by an assertion of the equality of all images. This reassertion of judgment introduces an ethical dimension into what was otherwise an ontological claim. Greuze goes from what is to what should be. This ethico-political turn that transforms what is to the what should be flattens politics into a decision between good and bad aesthetics. A judgment based on a capacity to express aesthetic equality. What I find troubling here is precisely that the politics of inclusion relies on a disavowed powerful subject who tolerates the outside via a decision that forecloses the image's politics, or an arbiter guarding the limit that allows everything in, but only on the condition that it perform the function of the expression of equal aesthetic rights. No images can be tolerated that do not themselves tolerate all. Furthermore, this inclusion of all is predetermined along strategically afforded lines. The inside tolerates the inclusion of the outside as long as it adheres to these pre-negotiated terms of the engagement, precisely that it act as an example of the equality of all images. Thus, Greuze's inclusion requires that the artwork obey the rules of the game. The limits of the community are constituted by this universal flattening. As such, once an image is admitted to the regime, it can no longer index its relation to the outside or the capacity that it has to not exemplify equality, but must precisely embody the divorce from its origins to be considered art. So non-art is inducted into the cabal of art on the demand that it commits patricide, but wears the sacrifice as a token of its continued inclusion. In Greuze, the category of art as such is defined by a regime that is open to its outside, precisely an unstable category that has been, as Adorno points out, defined by a situation whereby art revolts against its essential concepts, while at the same time being inconceivable without them. Perhaps this revolt has been too successful. What if the category of art today is inconceivable? Defined by the continual challenge to its limits, the category of art is always teetering on the brink of non-existence. And this instability, art's continual equal inclusion, perversely enacts the formation of a centralized power that legislates precisely what is and what is not allowed in. The category of art, while shifting, unstable, and continually morphing, produces the conditions under which art can be thought as such. Art as an expression of the equality of aesthetic rights legislates only for those conditions, an ideological process that forms both a juridical contract of acceptance by the institution and the institution itself. If we want to ask the question, what is art's power, then the answer has to be the formation of its own disavowed enclosures, its own positioning of itself as a form of self-governance produced by the integration of spectatorship into everyday life. So, for Groys, art is the space in which equality as such is performed precisely because art is capable of producing an example of an infinite sequence of images. Art precisely is the example, and quoting Groys here, that points to the utopian realm of aesthetic equality, as though that somehow produces a politics unencumbered by particular claims. A politics of universal rights that has the capacity for universal application across all situations, no matter what the situation demands. Which is to say, art is seen as a model by which politics could exist in some utopian future that will return to save us from our current hierarchized present, for our universal claim to value, regulated not through the interrelation between the universal and the particular, but by the eradication of the particular for the sake of the universal. But even Groys's claim that regional images resist the normative aesthetic control exerted by the current mass media, which shuns all regionality, this doesn't save them from becoming simply examples that assert the equality of all images, thus finally subsuming the particular into the universal. Equal aesthetic rights precludes a politics of particularity precisely because of its appeal to an asubjective universal that is not reached through the particular, but is shorn from it in a rejection of the local or regional horizon. Equal aesthetic rights, then, makes a jump over the subject into the void of abstract universalism. The exclusion of particular regional concerns in favour of an abstract universal plays into the production of a neoliberal politics that thinks equality is the levelling of the ground on which we stand, rather than the provision of support for the weakest to provide the conditions for equality. As we know well enough, free market capitalism proclaims an equality of opportunity, but does so at the disadvantage of the smallest, least powerful, favouring instead a maintenance of the centralisation of power within the wealthy elite. And the obverse is true of local politics that makes no claim to universality. They lack the strategy with which to unbind power. To put the universal in abeyance with undue focus on the particular dodges, as Greg Schazer, author of No Local, explains, important strategic questions in favour of an escape from the task of confronting capitalism. So neoliberalism doesn't care if you live off the land or start a community library. In fact, it prefers that you take local organisation off its hands, just as long as you don't attempt to upscale this organisation. So for Schazer, localism fails on every level, ethical, practical and political. So again, a globalism, shorn of its relation to the local, or a strategy shorn of its relation to tactics, cannot understand the regional particulates that construct and challenge it. If we can understand contemporary art then as locally focused on the trivial relationship it creates with its viewer, but not globally concerned with the contingencies within which it operates and the affects that it produces, and then Groys's equal aesthetic rights as universally applied without care for the local issues at stake, the equivalent of neoliberalism's handing down of universal human rights, then we need an art theory that intertwines both the particular and the universal and is capable of thinking the complexity of this entanglement. So now I'm going to pass over to Chris, and he's going to talk specifically about a project that we worked on together. It's a piece of work, it's an ongoing endeavour called When Platitudes Become Form. We worked on this project for a show at a London gallery at the end of last year. So Christopher.
Thank you, Tom. That conclusion that Tom, as a curator, has derived from theory, I have come to through my art practice. And I'll describe now an ongoing enterprise that I'm working on called When Platitudes Become Form. And this involves artworks by some of Sri Lanka's most celebrated young contemporary artists, which are then reconfigured by me for the Western art market. This remarketing of the south of the island's recent peacetime contemporary art boom channels funds that are not under government control to establish a media platform for resistance in the formerly Tamil-occupied territories of the north of the country from where my family originates. I myself was born in London after my parents fled escalating conflict at the beginning of that civil war that ended in 2009 in really the most brutal way that I could have imagined. And the Sri Lankan government leveraged international interests to annihilate their minority opposition. Now, the north of the island is about to be sold off to the international backers of that genocide, and contemporary art is now establishing itself, just like everywhere else, as the highest benchmark of connoisseurial consumerism. Of course, if my parents hadn't fled violence in Sri Lanka, I'd probably be brought up there, and I guess it's the gap between what counts as contemporary there and what counts as contemporary here that I'm exploiting to perhaps set in motion consequences that might undercut the parameters of either. So I purchase artworks through Sri Lanka's most prominent new gallerists. The artists whose work I reconfigure have become successful in the contemporary art boom in the south that has followed the genocidal end of the civil war there. You see, there wasn't ever a context for art that was called contemporary in Sri Lanka, but since 2009, Sri Lanka's unjust peace has produced economic prosperity, albeit corrupt. And this has brought with it Sri Lanka's first Western-style white cube commercial galleries. These galleries have marketized an accelerated context of the contemporary. And by contemporary here, I mean that it is derived through a localization of the Western art historical canon, much like we've seen on a bigger scale in China and India over the last decade. However, through decades of civil war, there is no institutional context for art in the north of the country. And one of my ambitions with this work is to participate through the media platform instigated there in instituting a context that is not contemporary. The overall composition of this work takes as its materials the whole system by which art is distributed. And doing it, I've come to understand art as ecologically contingent within its kind of networked reality. And this work sets in motion, I suppose, a conspiracy of consequences that could extend beyond the work's as yet visible horizons. Now, the gallery-cited part of this work can currently be seen not far from here at the gallery Krauper Tuscany Zeidler near Alexanderplatz, where on Friday afternoon Tom will be hosting a reception exclusively for Former West. Some of you may have seen this in the Former West Learning Place program, but all conference participants are more than welcome to join us for beer and soup and a tour of the exhibition led by Tom. You lucky, lucky things.
I don't write that.
I hope you'll all get to see it because kind of doing this work, I've come to understand spectatorship as part of the materials of the work rather than its sole purpose. And it seems to me that our received ideas about spectatorship in the gallery, derived from theatre through broadcast media, may not necessarily be appropriate for the big media of our day. What we call contemporary art came about in the television age, but media doesn't work like that anymore. Google and Facebook take us not simply as their spectators, but also as their very materials for all sorts of algorithmically processed purposes that have very little to do with us. Now we face the possibility of art's conventional institutions reconfigured within the broader ecologies of our networked reality, perhaps even reconstituting the very purpose of art beyond spectatorship. Might we face perhaps the potential of art's radical democratization into non-art? And how might we come to an ecological conception of art that happens through the actual interdependencies and consequences of art's contiguous reality, as opposed to a fantasy of spectatorship shorn from the reality of art's circulation? And what would that mean for who we are? Now, okay, I was going to talk about this in terms of art after the internet, but I don't think this lot really care about that. And again, I think we should get to your bit. So, in fact, what I've learned about when platitudes become form in relation to human rights transgressions in Sri Lanka comes back to Tom's critique of contemporary art's equal aesthetic rights. Boris Groys gives a good account in Art Power of the liberal logic of universal rights as it pertains to contemporary art, recognizing how, and I quote, "It's not the vertical infinity of divine truth that the artist today makes reference, but to the horizontal infinity of aesthetically equal images." In fact, it's probably worth quoting Groys a little further here. Some images that artists insert into the context of the international art scene signal their particular ethnic or cultural origin. At the same time, artists transplant mass media-produced images into the context of their own regional cultures as a means of escaping the provincial and folkloric dimensions of their immediate milieus. But in both instances, the images in question are simply examples that point to the infinite utopian realm of aesthetic equality, endowed with equal aesthetic rights. End quote. However, the trouble with contemporary art's assertion of universal aesthetic rights, as Groys puts it, is the same, at least structurally, as the trouble with the United Nations assertion of universal human rights. This liberal conception of universal rights permits the bombing of Syria to hand down human rights, but it prevents the addressing of structural oppression, because it invokes an abstract concept that is institutionally normalized without being able to address the means by which that normalization occurs. This is how the international community failed to prevent the 2009 genocide in Sri Lanka, much like it failed Rwanda before. Now, if you're really interested in the connection between art and human rights, I should point out that this relationship has been very thoroughly researched by Suhail Malik at Goldsmiths in London. So, in response to the consequences of the catastrophic ethical failure of universal rights in Sri Lanka, when platitudes become form, rather than asserting equal rights, deals with and in the ecology of structural exploitation, to set in motion a conspiracy of consequences against human rights. So, Tom, this brings us to what you were saying.
Thank you. So, if universal human rights cannot think structural oppression, that is the inclusion of particular claims within contingent contexts, then to take seriously any claim to understand the entanglement of the particular and the universal, we must think them through what I would call a cosmic order. That is, an ecologically contingent materiality within the extended network of the human and the non-human. For me, this theory is given its full weight by an understanding of the universal continuum as expressed by Iranian philosopher Reza Negrestani. For Negrestani, the cut from within and by the universal continuum is a way to think local, regional horizons as part of the interweaving of the particular and the universal. This becomes for him a true to the universal logic, synthetic and fully Copernican, whereby, to quote, absolute reflexivity of the universal, where the independent relation of the open universe to itself takes shape. If Copernicanism is the name given to the removal of man from the center of the universe, and can be equated with a scientific rationalism that posits the earth as part of and not distinct from the cosmos, then to follow this train of thought for art would require a similar repositioning. In an unpublished fragment of Robert Smithson's writing on Donald Judd from the late 1960s, the former reveals his antagonism to the latter's literal or interesting art. For Smithson, art was not to be interesting, which always presupposed a human addressee, thus preserving the personal, anthropocentric sense of authority, but it must be a cosmos, addressed to and within the universe rather than to the human and within the regime of the experience alone. So contrary to Judd's humanism, which recentered the subject, Smithson held that his work's scientific concerns enabled it to go past the phenomenology embraced by minimalism, and I want to propose that Smithson's proposition of a cosmic address can index an art that does not rely on human subjectivity as a transcendental guarantor. This address, I suggest, proceeds via an ungrounding logic that disarticulates the co-constitution of the world by thought that dominates our contemporary condition as articulated by the Duchampian concept of the art coefficient and given expression in, amongst other areas, the art historical period of the contemporary. The cosmic address is a true atheism, an address that does not locate a God position, but articulates itself towards and within a decentered and dispersed immanence, constituted by what Negrestani calls a universal continuum. So for contemporary art, the condition that we're not talking about, in a way, we are inbuilt into this condition. We're inbuilt into contemporary art as the external guarantor, required for the work to have meaning as such, and in some cases to exist at all. The contemporary condition defines itself precisely by this ahistorical co-positioning that determines the artwork by its concurrency. Art exists in correlation to the human. This correlation whereby art not only exists in temporal and spatial proximity to us, but is defined as such by that proximity by being shown, exhibited, put on display, presented for the purposes of interpretation. This correlation produces us as viewers in a very specific way. So for the period of contemporary art, we are the meaning of art. Art emanates from and is addressed to us in a banal cycle of finitude, determined by our terrestrial cognitive limitations. And yet this finitude produces a particular subject. It's one that understands itself as dominant over the object. That is, it ratifies the dominant subject that capitalizes on the object of the world and reinvests it with a moral superiority as afforded by the supposed ethics of left-leaning contemporary art. So contrary to this, contrary to the condition of the contemporary, the claim we make here is twofold. Firstly, artworks produce and partake in a raft of consequences outside their representation within a gallery space: political, economical, material, biological, environmental, and so on. Art engages in these regimes precisely because it contorts and controls flows. So flows of information, capital, services, physical stuff, people, institutions, because it produces more than just concepts. And secondly, art as an object, like all objects, embeds the noumena within the phenomena. The thing in itself, the noumena, is no different to the appearance of that thing. It has material conditions that cannot be contained nor expressed by cognition, cannot be expressed for subjective articulation. So the artwork cannot either be contained by thought, nor is it produced merely as a vehicle for thought, but it brings with it and is instaurated by aesthetic affects that are reliant upon the contingency of materials which, pertaining to no idealism, perhaps or perhaps not perturb other objects, including the viewer, but are not activated by or for the viewer. So art is capable of making, and regularly does make, propositions about the world in a non-conceptual way. That is to say, the work of the art is extra-philosophical. It can produce determinations that are beyond thought, beyond philosophy, beyond the human. For our conception of this twofold reading produces a contingent ecology within which spectatorship is but a material and not the external guarantor, and precisely disarticulates the co-constitution of the world by human thought, which relies upon the conservative binary of subject and object. To think in this way positions the work of art and the thought of it within a nested traumata of cuts from and by the unbound open. To quote Negrestani again, here trauma is not a rupture marking the centrality or discreteness of the regional subject with regard to its outside, but a regionalizing cut made by a higher universal order in its own continuous field. End quote. To follow an ungrounding logic true to the Copernican revolution resituates art within a cosmic region that interconnects, quoting Negrestani again, the particulate, the galactic, the stellar, the chemical, the biological, the socio-cultural, and the neurophysiological within a continuous, albeit topologically counterintuitive, universal gradient. On or entangled in the groundless ground of the synthetic given without givenness of the real, artwork addresses itself not to a human subject alone, but to a tangled cosmos. The entangled cosmos as itself an unbound openness nested by and nested into regional particularities. This Copernican revolutionary logic thinks a decentered relation between human and world, not the prioritized relation of subjective dominance that sees human capacity as the defining factor governing relations as such. I would argue that contemporary art, acting through a Ptolemaic counter-revolutionary mode, rehabilitates us to the trauma of the cut by grounding us in a subjective distinction from the world, providing the sufficiency of the world as a ground on which we can stand. Far from proposing we abandon the human, our claim pursues a logic of scientific realism that describes the universal absolute not as an infinite or alternative outside, but a continuum of the immanent real that necessarily includes and implicates that human. So the questions that we're kind of working through a decentering logic of the true to the universe thought, can we re-understand art's role as one not of the production of the fantasy of human dominance, but the furthering of the work of the absolute? Or to put it another way, to produce a cosmic address that situates itself as part of the nested regional cut within and by the universal continuum? Or to put it another way still, can art partake in a Copernican revolution that shifts the locus of meaning from the local sufficiency of thought to a dispersed and abstract infinite. To do so, art would be thrust into cosmic exile, a term coined by analytic philosopher Willard Quine to describe an impossible position outside the limits of human access, but taken up by Smithson as a positive task. This exile, or adherence to the cosmic logic of the inhuman, provides us with a radical orientation out of the finitude of human interpretation, eviscerating the anthropocentric counter-revolutionary correlation between thought and artwork. Any escape from the contemporary requires an inhuman material lure rather than an avant-gardist human hero to lead the way. The trajectory is not mapped by intellection alone, but by a synthetic ecology of hybrid geonetworks that imminently organize along a vector asymptotically approaching the scientific image. This vector is the cosmic address. Thus, Smithson's spiral works dislocate a segment of the dizzyingly infinite, becoming, as Thomas Crow points out, the sign and imprint of a perpetual tropism always unfulfilled towards the thing itself. This segmentation perpetually indexes the infinite spiral from which it is cut, rendering the continuum rather than art as a discrete object of appreciation. So art under the Duchampian condition, contemporary art, acts ideologically to produce forms of subjectivity that reiterate the bifurcation between culture and nature. Our aim here is to understand the interpretation of the work of art as part of a universal continuum that stretches through the organic and the inorganic, not as separated or higher from the continuum. Following Freud, the philosopher Ray Brassier describes the way a cell membrane is formed to protect the cell from external stimuli. A primitive organic vesicle, that is, a small bladder, cell, bubble, or hollow structure, becomes capable of filtering the continuous and potentially lethal torrent of external stimuli by sacrificing part of itself in order to erect a protective shield against excessive influxes of excitation. In doing so, it effects a definitive separation between organic interiority and inorganic exteriority, end quote. This he describes as a traumatic cut, a separation of the organic from the inorganic. This negentropic process of self-organization is described by Brassier as a technology, or techne. So negentropy, or negative entropy, is a description of cellular organization. So if entropy is the process of the energetic disorganization within a system, then negative entropy is the obverse, the organization into complex organisms and eventually life. Thus, all plants, animals, things have gone through negentropic processes to self-organize. As Brassier suggests, the contention is that the history of technology overlaps with the history of life, understood as a originary synthesis of techne and physis. There is no natural realm subsisting in contradistinction to the domain of technological artifice, because matter, whether organic or inorganic, already possesses an intrinsic propensity to self-organize. There is no natural realm in contradistinction to technological artifice. Or, to return it to the question at hand, the interpretive impulse of meaning production, apophenia, or reading meaning into objects relies precisely on a technology of negentropic self-organization that has formed the material substrates on which thought flows. The question of what is thought is supplemented by where is thought. If thought as such can be said to exist, where can we locate it? This question is vital for understanding the ecology of art. So thought cannot be said to be locatable as such, but dislocated. Thought itself is decentered. Thus thought, or the interpretation of art, is a contingent part of material processes that art seeks to engender through its particularities. So I'm going to jump a little bit, because we're running out of time. So while art, under this telling of it, might be capable of thinking according to the scientific real, that is, as part of technological negentropic self-organization, the expression of our genotype by our phenotype, we cannot do away with the idea of a minimal difference between art and life. Life here is the name we'll give to all activity that constitutes the real that is not art. We cannot truly naturalize art. Art is the extension of immanent self-organization, but we cannot attach the category of art to natural processes that look extra-organized, so trees don't make art. Art is a value category that we drape over certain material activities, or rather the guarantor of those activities. There is necessarily a gap between art and life. Even as art approaches life in an attempt to radically democratize itself, it must do so with the notion of distance from life, afforded by the nominal frame as art. This approach is asymptotic, that is, art will approach life but never fully reach it without a residual artness. Our claim is that this distinction, this space, or spacing that art performs, is not inhabited by interpretation alone, that to think art according to the real means that art must account for consequences outside of the reflexive relation to subjectivity. The supposition is that art can and does have real effects outside the production of meaning via interpretation, that while perhaps being returned to partake in the regime of interpretation, exist as uncorrelated to thought, which is to say these effects do not rely on interpretation as such, existing in spite and not because of the subjective experience of them. The challenge for art, we claim, is to produce spectators not as external guarantors, nor to think images as mere examples of universal flattening of politics, but to think an ecologically contingent material process within the extended network of a non-anthropocentric logic that understands art as a part of a continuum of both the organic and the inorganic. Thus, all art is necessarily networked, that is, worked by the interconnected cosmos. As such, we cannot proceed via an emancipated heroic subject stripped of their objectivity. Instead, networks themselves allow a thought of inhuman elements that form the contingent materialities of the world. So the cosmic address is not a jump over the subject into the void, but a radical inclusion of the whole into the whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was good.
So I guess we can open out to about 5 minutes of questions before you have to run off and watch Biffo Barardi. Oh, no questions at all. There's one at the back over there. Chap at the bottom of the stairs.
Hi, my name is Omar, and I appreciated the first part of the talk by Christopher because it was very accessible, and although there were many complex and consecutive thoughts, I still could follow through. But I'm sorry, Tom, I virtually understood nothing, and it felt like you were reading rather than actually trying to convey a thought or a concept or a meaning, and I don't know. I don't think that's very appreciated for the time that we've spent here.
Well, hopefully some of what we've been discussing will come out in the discussion that we can have now.
Can I ask if you've got a particular question that you'd like elucidating, and then maybe we can talk about it? Thank you very much.
I actually have a question, and it relates to 2 points that you made, which I perhaps did not fully identify with. One is the question of the Copernican revolution to be contra-anthropocentric and not anthropocentric. And I wonder then, how would you consider a reading of Ptolemaic idea of the universe, considering pre-Council of Trent theology, in which man is not at the center, God is at the center, and actually man is at the lowest position. He is in a sort of almost close to hell, and he's trying to reach the center, which is God. In that case, would not the Copernican revolution put God at the center, because put the humanity at the center, or become anthropocentric, because human becomes the point of view in a certain way? The other, it's also about the question of embedding the noumena into the phenomena. Art has disability. But you started your presentation by being precisely against the sort of Kantian philosophy of access, and yet you are using Kantian terms. So how can you try to transverse this limit by still remaining within its conceptual framework? How can you do this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is...
Yeah. I think that the position that we're trying to take is following a Copernican revolution that decenters rather than places a God position at the center. So while the Ptolemaic position would have man lowest and God at a central point, or have that as a kind of external guarantor, what the trajectory of the Enlightenment under Copernicus would have would be a scientific decentering that doesn't have a particular position, that has got a point of view. The second point, no, the decentered position that Copernican science would propose doesn't provide a sufficiency for thought based on the co-constitution of the world by human thought. So it doesn't provide the possibility that the real is constituted, there's a reversible relationship between the real and human thought. And why would we remain within the regime of Kantian discourse? I guess that Kant himself kind of struggled with the question of the noumena and didn't resolve it within the first critique. In fact, there's an addendum to the first critique within, he kind of, after the first edition, he wrote an addendum which returned back to the question of the noumena, suggesting that it may be possible to think it without the phenomena. So we're still playing with those kinds of regimes. Maybe for you the language isn't sufficient.
Also, this isn't to directly answer either of your questions, but your question made me think that actually what God is for art has kind of changed throughout the history of art, from actually God to the sublime to, we propose for contemporary art, that the God or the external guarantor of contemporary art is interpretation. And what we're proposing through this ecological conception of art is a radically atheistic proposition for art.
Yeah.
I'm sorry? You haven't got a microphone?
I precisely wanted to propose, because there will be plenty of opportunities to discuss these things, this concept further, as both Christopher and Tom will join some of the workshops, and there will be an opportunity to walk through the exhibition and discuss this particular concept in this particular specific instance. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining.